Well, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are, folks. Thanks so much for joining us. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Josh Barrett, and I'm currently an assistant professor at Memorial University of Newfoundland, Grenfell campus, and I'm also past president of the Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation, or CRRF as we like to call ourselves. And very delighted to be joined today by Ray Bollman, who is a CRRF lifetime member and former rural data lead for StatsCan, and I'm sure he'll introduce himself and chat a bit more about the things that he's interested in a few moments. But before we jump into that, I want to provide a few remarks. Firstly, I am based in Conception Bay, South Newfoundland, Labrador, which is the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk and the Mi'kmaq, and certainly be happy for folks to uh, acknowledge where they're find themselves today as they introduce themselves. Uh, Certainly on the call, I see some surf folks that I know and others that are new. And so I just wanted to take a few moments to talk a little bit about what surf is. The Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation was established in 1989 to provide a collaborative forum for rural research amongst leaders,
Ouais, je t'en
communities,
réunion, maman.
researchers, governments of all levels, and in many respects we're often knowledge brokers between researchers and rural Canadians. And so if you're interested in all of that, you'll certainly fit right in. I did want to provide just a few notes that you are certainly able to. One moment here we go. um my apologies, just getting situated. I would certainly happy for any non-members here. If you're interested in becoming a member, please do consider joining SURF. We have a 1 year and a 5 year membership option. We are a member-driven organization, and as such, there are a variety of benefits pertaining to our network. I won't rhyme all of this off here today, but certainly have a look at that. Here's some context about what we do, and we always have a lot of interesting and exciting projects ongoing. So would be pleased for folks to have a look. Quite affordable if you are interested in joining, and we have a QR code there as a quick and easy stop for folks if you are interested. Whether you're a member or not, maybe you got notice of this webinar because of our newsletter that does contain pertinent information regarding our organization, and we try to get that out once a month. And so whether you are a member or not, please feel free to join, check out our website, sign up for our newsletter, and there's lots of exciting information there that you might find valuable. I also wanted to note that Surf prides ourselves as being an advocate for rural Canadians, and in doing so, we issue a State of Rural Canada report every 3 years. Our most recent report was issued in 2024. I'll post a website of that report in a few moments. But we are in the very infancy stages of developing our next edition of the State of Rural Canada, which is slated to be released in 2027. And so if that's something that you might be interested in participating in, please do let me know. And before I pass it over to Ray, one of the marquee things that Surf tends to do is hosting an annual conference. And I invite all of you to come to Newfoundland, Labrador, and Corner Brook, where we're going to host with the North Atlantic Forum, Shore to Shore, and local Indigenous organizations our annual conference, June 16th to the 19th at Grenfell campus and Memorial University. Registration is now open. Abstract submissions are closed. We have quite a tight agenda. However, if you haven't gotten your submission in and you're very interested and keen on getting involved, please do let me know. We will see what we can do. But please, if that is of interest to you, try to reach out this week as we are in the process of finalizing our agenda. So I will post a link to that as well. Now, I've done a lot of talking. I will say this is intended to be an emerging researchers forum series, but I'm so happy that this got out to a number of different folks, and happy to pass it over to Ray now as he's going to be chatting about all things rural data. So, Ray, thanks so much for joining, and I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, thank you, Josh, and thank you to the Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation for the invitation. I'm supposed to push a button here. I think I succeeded. I need to, I can push that button from current slide. There we are. So here's a map. Oh, you're going through from 19 up to 2001, the change in population density in Canada. But picking up on what Josh was just saying, I'm so old, which is going to be my excuse for all my forgetfulness halfway through here. I'm so old, I was at the 1989 first conference of the Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation. And I have to say, it's an excellent, they put on an excellent conference because you always find good professors, lots of students talking to students, government bureaucrats, and often local practitioners in rural development. So it's the place to be, in my view. So here, I thought I should start with some evidence that I know something about rural. This is the farm where I grew up in rural Manitoba. And the top here, I say, a tour of rural data. Well, there's only so much you want to hear on a slideshow, but I've had to put together a detailed background paper, and some of you may have downloaded it. Yesterday, Josh put up a new version, which has corrected all the typos except the ones I missed. And so you may be interested in even downloading it now or later. More evidence of my rural background. I attended this one-room school, except everybody says, well, Ray, you work for Numbers Canada, and they look like there are two rooms there. Well, it turns out I spent 8 years here in the South Room, grades 1 to 8. By the time I was ready to graduate to grade 9, I was supposed to go to the North Room, but when that happened, when I was graduating from grade 8, the school bus came and took us to the high school in the town of Rivers, about 12 miles away. So there's my second piece of evidence that I used to know something about rural. And here's the outline of the paper. Here's the outline of the presentation today. And certainly sooner or later or right now, you want to look at that paper because there's a lot of stuff there. So let's start with an introduction. So the purpose of this presentation is to document the supply of data published by Statistics Canada. Obviously, other departments also publish rural data. And after all that, there are definitely data gaps. Here is the State of Rural Canada 3 report on bridging rural data gaps. Hannah Main put together a nice set of analysis along with her co-authors there. So more rural data is required. Here are some obvious places where more would be required. And I think, as every analyst knows, the value of data may be measured by the increase in the value of a decision relative to the decision taken without the data. So better data enables better decisions. Without firsthand dependable information, there's only rumor, conjecture, and controversy as a basis for decisions. And that was the reason for the Palliser expedition to the prairies in the late 1850s. Repeating myself, detailed background paper is where I drew all this stuff from. And please send all your questions to Mohammed at Statistics Canada. He put together a nice paper back last year. And the good news is his is a lot shorter and mine's probably too long. So where to start? Well, the best place to start is the Rural Statistics data page at Statistics Canada. And if you click there, you will see buttons to go to business performance data, health data, labor income data, ICT data, population, society, and income, society, community data. And then if you scroll down one page, at the bottom of the page, you get a few indicators here, more indicators. URL for the Rural and Small Town Canada Analysis Bulletins, a URL for these data viewers, nice maps, URL for rural client services, and up here, links to a number of very interesting interactive dashboards. And interactive dashboards are new for my looking at data, but it's amazing the data that they have on these interactive dashboards. With a click of a button, you change the map, you change the chart, you change the comparative tables. It's really quite amazing. So these are the buttons under economy, business accounts, business conditions, trade, industry employment, business profiles, rural Canada nonprofits. Under society, number and size of communities, annual demographic estimates, insurance benefit, EI beneficiaries, rural Canada housing profiles, and under environment, they point to some tables here relating to rural Canada. Okay, what is rural? Well, in my view, rural has two dimensions, density and distance to density. So on the density dimension, the bigger the places, the less rural you are. And also, the smaller the places, the more rural you are. So density, less rural, more rural. Distance to density, shorter distances to a town or city, less rural. More rural, longer distances to a town or city. So as I've already said, I grew up here, and the big city in your provinces would be up here. But here you are, less rural in distance, close beside a city, but you're out in the countryside. So there's countryside dwellers right beside a city. And in this dimension, you are in a bigger places. I don't know, Dauphin, Manitoba might be bigger, but you're a long ways from Winnipeg. So there's a very interesting dimensions and diversity here. So moving on, geographical units that may be classified as urban or rural. I want to concentrate on three different geographical units. So three key geographical units here, and then I'll move on to a classification of rural based on density, classifications of rural based on distance and density and distance to density, classifications based on distance alone, and then a few notes on this. So three key geographical units for building blocks. Dissemination blocks, they're small, bounded on all sides by roads and within the boundaries of every other Statistics Canada standard geographical area. These are small, so small you can only publish from the census population counts and dwelling counts, but no other data like poverty rates or number of teachers or whatever. A bigger unit for classification would be census subdivisions or incorporated towns and municipalities. And then a bigger division yet for a classic bigger building block yet would be census divisions, counties, regional districts. There are other geographical units, but I'm not familiar, and I don't think Statistics Canada has assigned any degree of rurality for these other units. Okay, classifications based on density alone. Specifically, that would be population centers. That's the long-standing definition for rural, well, long-standing definition in Statistics Canada, less than 1,000 people and less, population centers 1,000 or more and 400 more per square kilometer. Places outside a population center are rural areas. So these are built up areas. If you see a house at the side of town, is that part of the built up area? Yes or no? Click on this and follow the links and read the nitty gritty. The bottom line is this rural refers to the population outside of centers of 1,000 or more. And this has been the long-standing definition of rural within Statistics Canada. So back in 1851, maybe 2.5 million people in rural, maybe 200, 300,000 people in urban. And this has gone up over time, down, up, but there's 6 million people here now versus this is 2016 census, pushing 30 million. So moving on, so that was a classification based on density alone. No, it doesn't matter how close you are to any other place. Classifications based on density and distance to density, building blocks using CSDs. I label these, and Stats Canada often has the label rural and small town if you're outside of a CMA or CA. So the density dimension is the population size. CMA is 100K and more. A CA is 10 to 100K. And then the distance to density dimension comes in. If your CSD has 50% more of your workers commuting into the CMA or CA, then your CSD is delineated as part of that CMA or CA. So rural and small town residents are outside the tight commuting zone of CMAs and CAs. I'm calling it a tight commuting zone because if this was 40%, a whole bunch of other CSDs around your cities would be part of the CMA or CA. And of course, it's time for the confusion to begin. So here's a table. Up here we have the type of community, type of settlement, population centers, 1K or more, less than 1K in rural areas. Here's the type of labor market based on CSDs. They're bigger units. These are smaller units. And here within rural and small town, these are anybody less than 10K outside of CMA or CA. So there are 6 million people in the census rural areas. There are 6 million people in rural and small town. Only 4 million are overlapping. So if you're in a big city area, there are 2 million people living out in the countryside compared to the 23 million living in the city. If you're in a rural small town area, here are 2 million people living in small towns, more than 1,000, less than 10,000. So these are just overlapping. And so these two definitions, only 2/3 are overlapping, and they have different characteristics. Within CMAs and CAs, those living in the countryside have higher incomes than in the towns. If you're in rural small town areas, the people living in the countryside have lower incomes than one living in towns. So if people ask, do rural people have higher or lower incomes than urban? The answer is definitively yes. Point being, 6 million in each classification, only 4 million, 2/3 overlap, and different people, different characteristics. Within non-CMA, non-CA, there are metropolitan influence zones. So your CSD, if it has 30 to 49% commuting in, your CSD is labeled strong MIS, there's moderate, weak, and no MIS. Okay, moving on to classifications based on density and distance to density, using a bigger group here, the census divisions. There are groupings of CSDs, and there are groupings of census divisions that are predominantly urban, based on density, predominantly rural, based on density, but the distance to density criteria appears in the classification of intermediate census divisions, which are adjacent to the predominantly urban census divisions. So there's a different building block with a classification based on density and distance to density. Classifications based on distance alone. Stats Canada has a remoteness index for each CSD in Canada, census subdivision. The background paper points to the studies that have delineated this, where the data are. Proximity index is used dissemination blocks, small building blocks. How close are you to groceries, childcare, health, employment? And a lot more than half of rural people, however defined, are within this proximity. And of course, if you're further out, your proximity index is 0. Another classification that's important, I think, self-contained labor areas. They are groupings of CSDs. Ashman Knoll did all the work on this using reciprocal commuting flows. Looked at one CSD, CSD-A, how many people commute, let's use the word travel, to the neighboring CSD to work, and then how many commute from CSD-B back to CSD-A. I should slow down. Anyway, what are the commuting flows between those two CSDs? If there are lots of commuting, that looks like a self-contained labor area. Well, let's look at the third CSD adjacent. What's their commuting into these two CSDs? And they get added in. So these self-contained labor areas all have commuting within, therefore self-contained, very little commuting out, very little commuting in. The policy idea is this would be a functional economic area And it seems to me a useful tool for local economic development assessment, local impact assessment, because you want to look at quote unquote locals, i.e. not in commuters that are employed in local jobs. Big issue here, nomenclature. Let me repeat twice, read the footnotes. That's once. Let me say it again, read the bloody footnotes, because I got confused myself in some of the tables I was looking at to find the footnotes, to find out when they said rural, what did they mean? They used the rural for different classifications of rural, of rurality. Okay, moving on. Valerie Duplessis did a nice piece in 2001. There is no correct classification of rural. She and her colleagues said, we strongly suggest the appropriate definition of rural should be determined by the question being addressed. We suggest the appropriate response is, the answer depends upon the issue you are addressing. Why are you asking how many people in rural? Why are you asking what's the poverty rate in rural, and so on. So analysts are encouraged to determine if their issue has a local focus, a community focus, or a regional focus. Small community, small local building blocks, communities, maybe census divisions. And obviously much has been written on the concept of rural. Is rural a geographical concept, or is it a social representation, culture, or way of life? And here's a pointer to Valerie's piece. Roland and Heather and I were cheerleaders and helped her along. And the point of all this is our tour today of rural data focuses entirely on geographical perspectives of rurality. Data. I bet some of you signed up for data, and I've been going through stuff for how many minutes now? Data sources. Well, at the very first page, I said, go to the rural statistics page in Statistics Canada and click on all those buttons. And that's an excellent way in, and that's where you should start. Alternatively, folks like myself who were studying all this stuff before they came in with that Rural Statistics Data Hub, I would start at the Statistics Canada data page. It looks like this. Here is the URL, and you can filter all these tables, 13,000 tables on this website for all Statistics Canada's tables, and you can filter by keyword, census of population, subject, scrolling down here, so you can search by keyword, census of population, subject, geography, frequency, survey, and statistical program. There's got to be hundreds and hundreds of those. It's a very long list. So keywords, let's scroll down here. Geography, they 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 here, and they say more. Let's click on more. Here are all the more geographical regions that you can see on this webpage. And carefully or quickly looking down there, there's one word that is conspicuous by its absence, rural. So yes, you can go back to that keyword thing and type in rural, and you get lots of things, some rural and some I couldn't find the rural in those tables. But here, if you went to census agglomeration, look at those tables, they might have leftover, residual, not of interest, which would be all of non-CMA, non-CA. You can click on census divisions and apply any census division criteria you want. Census subdivisions are here, economic regions, health regions, policing. These policing, there are some tables that show reports of, I forget, certain crimes for each police constituency, each police force coverage area, each town in the country. And you might want to say Dauphin is rural. People in Dauphin might say we're a small town. And so you have to figure out how you want to classify these to rural to do a rural analysis. So I used to start anyway at the Stats Canada data page. Census of population. Well, let's look at some data. Here we're looking at non-metro, outside CMAs of 100,000 or more. The population went up from 86 to 91, but then some of these non-metro places got classified as metro, so you have fewer people now in non-metro. Reclassification. Population up, reclassification. Population up, reclassification. Population up, small reclassification. Population up, reclassification, population up. Population grew in every period. We've got essentially the same number of people in 2016 as it was back in 1986. Caveat emptor, I guess is the point. For rural and small town, there are 8 million people in rural and small town, non-CMA, non-CA. Population grew here, reclassification grew here, reclassification, so on. Now there are about 6 million people in rural and small town, and there are 8 million. Once again, growth in almost every period and fewer people at the end. Here's the one period where the rural and small town population actually declined. Here, the 1996 and the 2001 numbers are all classified in 2001 boundaries, so no reclassification there. So you can see within constant boundaries, rural has always been growing, except in this one period. Bottom line, rural population grows. It's always lower at the, and some rural localities get reclassified. So I think, on-the-ground rural development colleagues, they want to grow the population, grow the jobs. So consider the delight if you're briefing the Minister of Rural Development when the census results are released. Great news, Minister. There was growth in the rural population. And other news, you now represent fewer individuals than you did before. So moving on from census to population, there are annual demographic estimates on age and gender for each census subdivision. And if you pick, there are 10 different scenarios here in these projections. So if one of the projections is what you think the future holds for your CST, there's a population projection for your CST going out 10, 20 years. Moving on to the labor force survey, there's monthly data for rural small town areas, monthly data for self-contained labor areas, for economic regions, and obviously the data is on employment by industry, employment by age and gender, unemployment rates, et cetera, et cetera. Within here, there are subgroups. So they have two major subgroups, CMAs and CAs, over 10,000, and non-CMA, non-CA, which I like to call rural and small town. And within this group, they have data for urban fringe, urban core, urban fringe, rural fringe. Here, they have data for small towns and rural areas. So if you want to go back to population centers, about 1,000 people or more, you want to add together the urban core, the urban fringe, and these small towns. And if you want the census rural, outside places of 1,000 or more, you want to add together rural fringe and rural areas. Rural Canada business profiles. Well, there's a whole bunch to go through here, and I'm going to run out of time. So point back to the background paper. For each of these, I have pointers to some of the reports based on these data, and I try to point to all the tables I could find on Rural Canada business profiles. So you want to look at the background paper to get the bump from each of these data sources. So business profiles, business conditions, business openings and business closures, monthly data on for rural and small town. Or is it non-metro? Oh, I forget. Canadian Social Survey, some monthly data, and within there, click on other socioeconomic characteristics, and that's where you'll find a rural-urban flag. General Social Survey, long-standing survey in Statistics Canada, and since I first posted the paper, they published a report on how satisfied are you with your time use. Here's the URL for the paper, and here's the table number, satisfaction. And over here, selected socioeconomic characteristics, click on that, and you will get a whole bunch of things, including rural, urban. And if you just know the table number, you put that table number straight into Google, it'll take you straight to the table in the Statistics Canada website. So there's data on annual income statistics for non-CMA, data on well-being and life satisfaction, data on quality of life, data on deprivation, social resistance, social vulnerability for small geographic areas, CSD data on quality of life, community well-being index, also at the CSD level. This started in 1981 when the forerunner of the Federal Indigenous Affairs Department looked at the data for First Nations reserves and for the data for neighboring CSDs, wanted to find out just what's the well-being differences, good news and bad news, for any First Nation community compared to the communities around them. Gross domestic income, employment insurance beneficiaries, building permits, trade, exports out of rural Canada, imports into rural Canada, nonprofit organizations, number, revenues, expenditures, health of Canadians. Well, sometimes you find studies that they crunch the microdata, publish data for rural and for urban. And sometimes you can find some tables that you might find helpful. And since I put first version of the background paper together, these folks published these data based on the Canadian Health Survey on Children and Youth on screen time. And within there are rural-urban comparisons for most of their variables. So that's an example of a study has rural and urban hidden in it. Sometimes you have to look hard, carefully and hard, or hard and carefully. Canada Emergency Business Account, Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy, rural and small town data in each case. These are started with the COVID, and not all of them are continuing, but the data are still there for the COVID period. Within equal zones, equal provinces, equal regions, there's one table there. You look under selected social demographic statistics, and there's a rural urban flag. Gross domestic product for non-CMA. And I talked earlier about data for each police service, and you might want to code those as urban and rural. And there's some other data sources in the background paper. So one final point here, I think rural communities have a significant role to play, quoting the Secretary of State for Rural Development. Rural Canada has 13% of the national population, contributes 27% of the GDP. Rural, 27%. Rural Canada is really, really doing their part. Well, that means rural GDP per capita is about the double the national GDP per capita, right? Why was not the Secretary of State standing up in the House of Commons waving the flag? Look at how productive we are. Well, this happens to be a comparison of two different groups. The numerator is the GDP, I think, in non-CMA. So the GDP produced by everybody outside of centers of 100,000 divided by the population, everybody in the outside centers of 1,000. So small number of people here. It's either 13% or 19%, I'm not sure which, and a big number here. So that's how you get a lot of GDP from a few really important rural folks. So you want to compare the population and the GDP for the same group of individuals. And for two different ways of defining rural, neither one which I've talked about today, you go to figure 13 and table 7 in the background paper. And I think it's about 23% of the population and 23% of the GDP in the two different definitions of rural they use. In any case, rural Canada is doing their part. So sometimes you have to go for the more definitive view on the role of statisticians. Here's Charlie Brown. All right, we've heard the report from our statistician. Both our hitting and our fielding averages are down this year. So we all know what we have to do next, right? Lucy, get a new statistician. Well, yes, there's some fear among statisticians that if you always publish bad news, the bad news may be you lose your job. So here's the April job stats. Look at the numbers over time, well off the chart. So this fellow was saying, and this is where the statistician got laid off. Suggesting that if you keep publishing bad news, they don't want you, they're going to lay you off. I think there's a different story to be told here. Watch this line. Everybody else has been laid off. There's nobody else to lay off. The last person that got laid off was the statistician. Everybody wanted the statistician to keep there to find out what the situation was really like. So that's my evidence that the last person to get laid off will be a statistician. The role of the statistician is vital, very valuable. And I don't know what that says, but if I spelled it better, I might know what to do. So I started with an introduction. Rural data are important, and better data enables better decisions. Where to start? Start at the Rural Statistics Data Hub page at Statistics Canada. Points to almost everything I talked about. What is rural? I think there are two dimensions, density and distance to density. I talked about 3 geographical units, dissemination block, census subdivisions, which are bigger, and census divisions, which are bigger. In each case, different people, Stats Canada included, have classified them as urban or rural. So you get different numbers, different characteristics, but different people for different purposes will classify these places as urban or rural. And I just went through a long list of data sources. I think the background paper should be helpful. And the topic of the background paper, there she blows. And I should take a rest and let people discuss, ask questions. Maybe I can help. Hopefully some colleagues from Statistics Canada can also help. Thank you, Josh.
Well, thank you so much, Ray. That was very informative. I know I learned a lot. I know a lot of folks learned a lot too, based on some of the commentary that we're getting. And I've been asked by several folks if it's going to be recorded, can we get access to your slides, all of that stuff. The answer is yes, but also just to reiterate, as on the slide right now, there is a guidance paper ultimately is what it is that Ray has prepared. And so I would encourage folks to please go on our website and look at that, because I believe that will be very handy for you folks, a very useful tool as you go about the important work that you all do. So thanks for that. We have some time for questions. We have a couple of questions in the chat already, so I will go by order, though the order seems to change. But in any case, that's fine. So the first question that I have that we've had some discussion on is, what is the population bar to be labeled rural? Is it 5,000 people or 10,000 or what have you? Do you have any comments on that, Ray?
Well, try to pick up on the piece that Valerie did. It depends. So the long-standing definition of rural, and most times when Stats Canada says rural, they go back to 1851 and saying it's always been living outside a population center of 1,000 or more. So when the census says rural population, they're talking about outside a center of 1,000 or more. I happen to prefer a more labor market oriented thing, which is outside CMAs and outside CSA, outside census metropolitan areas, outside census agglomerations, therefore outside the tight commuting zone of a place 10,000 or more. So rural and small town, non-CMA, non-CA. I usually prefer that for discussing policy issues and so on. But that's assigning CSDs to a category. And if you're doing more regional analysis, maybe you need census divisions. I don't know. So the quick answer is, what's the bar? What's the cutoff? What's the bar? Where do you draw the line? Yes. We should have a quick chat on what's your project, what's your policy
Yes.
issue, what's the topic of your thesis, and so on. And there are various ways you can draw a line for rural and urban on population or a whole bunch of other details on the Stats Canada website.
Thanks for that, Ray. And
So
that's
the answer is I don't know. That's one way of saying it. But
there was some discussion in the chat regarding this distance versus density bed, and ultimately the way in which you measure or use the word rural will depend on those contextual factors. So good to hear that from you as well. There was a question on, do we have GDP by economic regions?
quick answer is I do not think so. Not that I know of. But they had GDP, they had domestic income. That's not the economic region, that was non-CMA, right? I forget. Maybe I should go up a bit and discover that. But anyway, I don't think so is the answer. where was this? So annual income estimates for non-CMA, non-CA. Income is a big, the earnings, wage earnings is a big part of GDP. So you can get an indicator there of GDP, but that's not GDP. So no, it's quick.
GDP's down below.
Yes, but at the very bottom, it's GDP for non-metro areas also, yes. But I pointed to two different ways that the colleagues did when I was talking about the minister's Secretary of State, the bottom there, I pointed to two things in the background paper. Two different reports use two different definitions of rural, none of that I talked about here. And as soon as they got with their definition of rural versus urban, they got 23% of population GDP. The other person did a different definition of rural, and they did the GDP and population also got 23%. And I'd have to go back because I don't remember. One person was doing a 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer grid and assigning a European Union category of rural versus urban and got the results. The other person was, I already forget, which is why the background paper there, which is evidence of everything I learned thanks to Josh in the last 6 weeks.
Excellent. Thanks for that. We have time for a few more questions, so by all means, please keep them coming in. And also, if you wanted to speak, please use the hand raise function at the bottom of your screen. You should see react. If you click on that, there is a raise hand, just so that I can monitor and see who's speaking and we don't all chat at once. But if you choose not to speak, by all means, please comment and we will get to you. Another question from Cindy. You talked about gaps in rural data. Would immigration to rural areas of all types be one of those gaps?
Again, depends how you define rural. At the census division level, there are tables of what are the components of population change from one year to the next in a census division. So births, deaths, in migrants, out migrants, and these migrants tend to be broken down into different groupings of which I forget. And at one time, there were tables, if somebody's coming into your census division, is it from a census division in your province or a census division from another province? And that was very interesting, how many people are moving back from the oil sands back to Nova Scotia, when the only way to make money in Nova Scotia is send a family member off to the oil sands. So yes, the components of migration are available at the census division level on an annual basis. I better stop talking because I'll say too much that I don't know. I don't know of another source off the top. The census will say, where did you live 1 year ago and where did you live 5 years ago? So you might find out, gee, I lived in a different town 1 year ago, lived in a different town 5 years ago. So there is, that's one other measure of mobility.
Perfect. Thanks for that. Another question. Is it okay to use employment by industry to calculate GDP?
Quick answers, I don't know. Again, GDP is sort of the total wage bill and the total return to capital. So GDP is return to labor and return to capital. And so if you're in the oil sector in Fort McMurray, your wage is higher and you're going to have a bigger shot at GDP than if you're just down the road from here operating a gas station and you're sort of in the same industry, gasoline or oil industry. So with a lot of assumptions, you might be able to get something helpful. Other than that, if you're using employment, you're basically assuming everybody's got the same wage, unless you look at the wages earned for each industry in your geographical area. But then you still have to assume what's the ratio of wages to capital, and I don't know. Where I think it's Census Division 7 in Manitoba, land is the capital.
I think it would be a bit challenging. because there's also exports and other consideration when it comes to GDP. So, um, but again, it would depend on, I guess, as you were saying, Ray, how you define rural and what the nature of the industries are in a given area. Maybe it
Yeah.
would be relevant depending.
Yeah.
This is a question, I think, for the group, but I'll pose it to you, Ray, in case you have any thoughts given your career in this. Um, are you aware of any municipal census that have happened over the years in rural or less central areas? This individual is saying they're more common in Alberta, but you don't really see any them done anywhere else. And have you had any experience with municipal census, and have you seen are they is there any utility to them? Is there any use, or are they not overly useful?
Well, on the useful, depends what question you have, obviously. So obviously very important, very useful if you have a question trying to figure what's happening across municipalities. I don't know of any data across all municipalities in Canada. Within Statistics Canada, they have sub-provincial data on local governments, but they basically get from the municipal affairs people in, say, Halifax or Charlottetown or whatever, what's the total taxes received and what's the total expenditures for all municipal governments in the province. And they could ask the province to send the data in by municipality. And as far as I know, they have not got there yet. But as you saw by some of the charts, the dates and some of the charts, I've been retired for a while, so maybe there's been great progress there, and I don't know. So there is a group within Statistics Canada on government finance data, and at that level, I'm not sure how much progress they've made at the municipal level. So maybe there's some Stats Canada colleagues on this call here who know the answer to that.
Well, while we are waiting, or if there is any additional comments on that, I did want to note, as a local government researcher myself, we often say local governments are creatures of the province, and a lot of the financial data and some of those things for municipalities are often um, at liberty of being released by the province, if not the municipality. So that's other considerations for getting that type of information. But I agree, Ray. There hasn't been a whole lot of national work done on those specific things
Yeah.
in
And
recent
you're right.
time.
I think for most provinces, they would have the data for each municipality. And you just need somebody to say, okay, all provinces agree to send along the
Yeah,
municipal data to somebody like Stats Canada.
yeah.
Yeah.
We have a couple more minutes. Is there anybody else that has any questions before we depart? I'm not seeing any in the chat, but I will provide one final ask in case folks have any. Oh, I see Ryan in the room,
Yeah,
very eager to chat. Please
okay.
take it away.
Thank you, Ray. I was just wondering about the future of databases and the system of statistics concerning the increasing number of remote work, telecommunications, and the preference for, after the pandemic, the preference for rural lifestyles. So, taking into consideration that the system is based on density and distance to density, what will be the future of this? I don't know if I put the question right, sorry.
Yeah. Uh, well, we've had commuting to cities for decades and decades and decades. I mean, how many people drive from Renfrew into Ottawa? That's a long drive, but I bet there are some people. Where they live, where the kids go to school, would be in a small town, Renfrew. If you're a deputy minister for the government in downtown Ottawa, you're making a significant amount of money. So there's a difference between place of work and place of residence. And the census has data on place of work and place of residence. So you can find out if you reside here, how many people work there. If you work in place Z, how many people live in place W, and all that sort of thing. So that's the mobility of workers. But you're right. if you're doing remote work, where do you live and where do you work? Well, I work in the other room, but my employer is, 500 miles away. If you're in Halifax, working at distance for, I don't know, Department of External Affairs or something, where are you working? Well, that's my employer. What do I say on the census? But theoretically, what do you mean where you work? And so life gets more complicated as technology changes. I think that's my observation.
While this isn't an answer to your question, I will plug our conference once again, happening in Corner Brook, June 16th to the 19th. Specifically, Dr. Keith Story has been doing some work with respect to digitization and in the mining sector. So it might not be specifically what you're talking about, and it's not a central national repository of data. However, he has been looking at what technology and AI has meant for some of these more remote workers, but historically it's been very labor intensive on the job, but there's shifts happening. And so that could be a case study for what we might see in other sectors and how that impacts the way in which we measure some of these labor changes. A couple more, thank you for that. A couple of more in the chat, and I'd say we'll probably cut it off after this, but if there's one more question, please by all means put it in. Question here, what is your opinion on the Rurality Index of Ontario, specifically on the use of it as a compensation model or classification on what counts as a rural healthcare service area? So a little specific, but Ray, do you have any comments on that?
Quick answer is I'm not familiar with their rural health districts or classification in Ontario. What I thought you were going to be talking about was the Rural Ontario Institute have a lot of data on their website, a lot of good data. But when they talk about rural Ontario, they're talking about non-metro. Anything outside of 100,000 or more is rural. So another definition of rural that I wouldn't use, I would call it non-metro. So caveat emptor again, when you look at the rural data that they publish and they're lobbying on behalf of, it's people outside of 100,000 or more. Back to the health things, I might have read some stuff back in the day, but it's been a long time ago, so I should stop when I'm ahead. I guess just one more comment before we close. I just want to celebrate the work that all my new colleagues at Statistics Canada have done since I got out of the way. Some really amazing, good collections of data, new data sources, and the mapping and the interactive dashboards are really neat. So full marks to the new group of rural data analysts, data statisticians, if you will, at Statistics Canada.
Perfect. Thanks, Ray. We have one final question if you're able to field it. And before that, there has been some discussion in the chat about some of the challenges of rural and what's interpreted as rural in Ontario, based on what you said as well. So certainly appreciate that. Ray or anybody else from Statistics Canada on the call, out of curiosity, has there ever been a conversation around standardizing CSDs a bit across the nation or a portion thereof? I have some difficulty comparing data in rural and northern settings, given the wide variation of landmass population in these areas.
Yep. Well, first of all, municipal boundaries, as you've said, municipalities are wholly owned subsidiaries of the provincial government. So those boundaries change at will, and Statistics Canada will follow those boundaries because the mayor or the reeve of the municipality wants data for his or her municipal district. So if the boundary changes at the provincial level, the Stats Canada data change. Your other question was, is there a standardization? Well, again, I'm not familiar with somebody doing the grid, but I say one colleague at Stats Canada uses 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer grid. And then he or she found the data in those 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer grid. So there's a standardization, if you will, 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer, what's in that 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer, And you can add that up regardless of how governments change the bloody municipal boundaries. So there's a link to that person's report, and you may follow up. I think it's Mark Brown. You might follow up with that. But I agree. How do you do subprovincial analysis when everybody's living in a big town? I don't know what the big town is, but yeah, the issue, if the issue is north, yeah, the land mass is so large that it's hard to get. You can get population counts for small areas, but to get the annual income, you need a couple hundred people in your geographical unit in order to publish the numbers and not breach the confidentiality requirements. So confidentiality comes in at that point. You already knew
Thanks,
that, guys.
thanks for that. I do see a hand raised from AM. Is this related to the question or is it something else?
Yes, I am one of the colleagues from Statistics Canada you were referring to. My name is Ash
Perfect.
Monroe. So I just wanted to chime in there. Ray has already covered part of what I was going to mention. The grid-based analysis is one thing we've done. I want to say that as part of our work with the Rural Group, we've also been doing some work with custom clustering. The SLA, self-contained labor areas, are an example of that, clustering together groups based on commuting flows to form roughly analogous groups where at least you know something about the population. But we've also looked at, for example, starting at dissemination blocks and clustering upwards to reach population thresholds in rural areas to create areas that can be populous enough to have data published on them, but do not necessarily encompass the enormous land areas that some rural CSDs are known for. So using the block boundaries as a kind of definitional statement for where the population are actually living. So it's a lot of work. There's nothing, I would say, off the shelf available for people to download right now to do this kind of work. But there's definitely methodology that could be followed. And I encourage people to reach out to our team, the Rural Data Lab at Statistics Canada, if you ever want more information on potential methodologies or help. We have several open source projects that we freely share the code so that you can do this at home if you feel like spending a lot of time on your computer.
Evidence that the youngins at Stats Canada are doing great work.
I'm no longer in that category, but yes, the people who joined since me are doing great work, and also excellent presentation, which I wanted to say just in general.
Thanks, Ash.
Okay, so that is our time for today. Thank you. And there's so many accolades in the comments, Ray. Appreciating your time and all of your wisdom. So thanks so much on behalf of SURF and everybody here today. Really appreciate you coming. Thanks to everybody who registered. We do have this recorded and we will try to get this on our YouTube channel and out to those who've registered and the wider public as soon as we can. If you haven't, please consider checking our website, becoming a member, and checking our conference webpage as well. Ray, I'll give you the final word to you. Is there anything else you want to say before we conclude?
Can I retire again now?
Yeah, you've earned, as I've said before, you've earned your retirement. So please, by all means, go back in the shadows.
Yeah, I'll try to retire again, hopefully
Yes.
successfully this time. Thank you.
Very
Thank you, George.
appreciate your time. Okay, folks. Thanks so much.